From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Now on to tonight's event. To begin, Robert Pinsky and his translator, Luis Alberto Ambroggio, will read and discuss Robert's poems and their Spanish translations. There are on everyone's seat a printout of the poems from their new book of translations, Ginza Samba Selected Poems. After their half-hour presentation talking about those poems and the work they did in translating them, Hispanic Division Chief Georgia Dorn, who I previously mentioned, will lead a moderated discussion, and then we'll leave some time at the end for your questions, which I hope you'll ask. You also have a print program on your seat, and you can learn more about our featured speakers. Let me say how honored I am to be hosting one of our most beloved poets laureate, the only laureate to serve 3 consecutive terms in the position. And believe you me, I've seen what it's like to be a poet laureate from behind the scenes, and it's a lot of work, especially if you have a signature project as wonderful as Robert's. To find out more about his Favorite Poems project, which he launched as laureate and has continued for more than 15 years, you can visit www.favoritepoem.org. You can also see the new Favorite Poem Project Chicago, co-sponsored by our good friends Poetry Foundation, at www.poetryfoundation.org/Favorite Poem Chicago. It's worth checking out. It's very exciting. People here know who Rahm Emanuel is, and it's great to hear him read poems too in his new job as mayor of that city. But first and foremost, this event tonight celebrates the cross-cultural, multilingual appeal of Robert's own poetry. As Troy Jollymore argued in the Washington Post, quote, "Sadness and happiness, beauty and ugliness, peace and violence, each has its place in Pinsky's capacious poetry, for its universe is the one in which we all live," end quote. And I can think of no better poet, translator, and event to challenge former consultant Robert Frost's statement that poetry is, quote, "what gets lost in translation," end quote. Please join me in welcoming Robert Pinsky and Luis Alberto Ambroggio.
Thanks so much. I think maybe I should start by saying a little bit Spanish. It's a tremendous honor to have the poet Luis Alberto Ambroggio, joined by the poet Andres Catalan, to translate my poems. It's a kind of a dream for me. And we're talking about the main language of this hemisphere, the second language of the 2 languages in the United States, arguably the language that was the first language spoken by Europeans in what became the United States, second language in the world to Mandarin. It's the only one that is spoken by more people. But I also want to add a little bit about Spanish in my own life. Luis Alberto recently has translated my essay, 7 pages, called My Spanish, in which I confess that when I was in the 8th grade, I thought it would be cool to learn French. But I was in what was known colloquially as the dumb class, or the bad class. And as I say in the essay, because of ridiculous social history of the United States and New Jersey, Los Bobos, they were first studying the language of Góngora and Cervantes. And as I say, because I was one of the Bobos, I learned the difference between ser and estar. So that these poems being translated into Spanish language, which I did study in high school and then in college, and of which I have forgotten a tremendous proportion of what I learned, it has a special personal meaning to me that I'm not only translated into this great world language, the language not only of Cervantes and Góngora, but of Borges and Neruda and Lorca and so forth. So I'll just make that my preface and my gratitude to this poet and his colleague poet, that of all languages, this is the one that probably means the most to me, to have my work incarnated in this language.
He wants me to talk in Spanish, but I think that I will continue on doing it in English with an Argentine accent. I guess most of them here are totally bilingual, right? Unless, okay, well, basically...
Más o menos.
Más o menos, okay. If not, I'll start in Spanish, but probably would be better. But anyways, it was really a challenge, and a great challenge, but a really fantastic challenge for me to translate Robert Pinsky poetry. We went together to Granada, and I did a translation of some of the poems for that particular event. And basically, because I fell in love with his poetry, but then also I was very frustrated because I couldn't quite translate it the way I understood it, written in English, like the sound. I mean, he's a jazz musician. The words, like on the poems, the Refinery, a newspaper man in Granada or Nicaragua asked me, well, listen, how do you do that? Because it's impossible to imitate the sounds that there were on that particular poem. And I cited precisely what Ortega said. Listen, some people think that translation is a utopia. But on the other hand, it is done, so you can find it there. So that's what we got together. But it was a really great challenge. I am really grateful, and I'm grateful to the Hispanic Division and the Office of the Poet Laureate of this opportunity to celebrate together the Hispanic Heritage Month. We have been doing that with the sponsorship of the director of the Hispanic Division for about 20 years, celebrating the poetry written in the US in Spanish for 450 years. And now we have Robert Pinsky, a great poet, a civic poet, present in our Hispanic American world. And I am very happy for that.
Should we read some poems?
Yes, sure.
What should we start with?
Samurai Song. We'll go in the order.
Well, maybe something else with the alternating stanzas better to do second.
No.
Okay.
English first and
As you said.
Spanish second.
The whole poem or just?
Yeah, the whole poem.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a poem called Samurai Song. When I had no roof, I made audacity my roof. When I had no supper, my eyes dined. When I had no eyes, I listened. When I had no ears, I thought. When I had no thought, I waited. When I had no father, I made care my father. When I had no mother, I embraced order. When I had no friend, I made quiet my friend. When I had no enemy, I opposed my body. When I had no temple, I made my voice my temple. I have no priest, my tongue is my choir. When I have no means, fortune is my means. When I have nothing, death will be my fortune. Need is my tactic. Detachment is my strategy. When I had no lover, I courted my sleep.
Canto samurái. Cuando no tuve techo, hice de la audacia mi techo. Cuando no tuve cena, mis ojos cenaron. Cuando no tuve ojos, escuché. Cuando no tuve oídos, pensé. Cuando no tuve pensamiento, esperé. Cuando no tuve padre, hice del cuidado mi padre. Cuando no tuve madre, abracé el orden. Cuando no tuve amigo, hice del silencio mi amigo. Cuando no tuve enemigo, me opuse a mi cuerpo. Cuando no tuve templo, hice de mi voz mi templo. No tengo sacerdote, mi voz es mi coro. Cuando no tengo recursos, la fortuna es mi recurso. Cuando no tenga nada, la muerte será mi fortuna. La necesidad es mi táctica, el desapego, mi estrategia. Cuando no tuve amante, cortejé a mi dormir.
I may be better in Spanish.
Robert.
What is next?
The next.
Food?
Yeah, food.
This is a poem I wrote during the festival in Granada, Nicaragua, when it wasn't the first time I met Luis Alberto, but Granada is an extraordinary city. Nicaragua is a poor country, and at that poetry festival, they bury an abstraction every year. So we had a long funeral procession my year for desamor, lovelessness, and Cuerpo de Desamor is in a hearse, and it's a parade. People are in costumes. When I say people, I mean El Pueblo. Everybody in Granada is in costume, and there's a big float full of poets that follows the hearse of Desamor. And at every street corner, I have pictures of this, I can prove it. An immense crowd of Granadans gathers. The poet walks up to the top of the float and reads a poem. Everybody applauds, and you go on to the next place until you get to the cemetery and bury Desamor. And this poem, and it has to be said, there are also children begging in Granada. And it's a country that has survived terrible violence. It still has terrible stresses, cultural, political, of all kinds. Poetry is very important there. And this is the poem that I wrote during that time that I was first getting to know Luis Alberto. And the poem is full of details from that trip, though like most of us, I of course relate them to my own life and my childhood. The poem is called Food. Food. Substance of lack, prime substance of desire. If you can cook like the way you walk, Chiquita, I'll eat it down to the husk. Actually a Cuban thing. Sí. Coser como caminar, voy a comerlo a la raspa. In Granada, Nicaragua, the logo food. Food, blazoned on a truck. A trademark word like Haagen-Dazs in no language except in the shadowy tongue of meanings. A child beggar points to his mouth. Substance of communion, substance of need. When I was a kid, the family fought over it nearly as much as money. Food, food, food. My mother, who refused to cook, fought bitterly with her mother, my grandmother, who lived 4 doors away. I, the ashamed child courier for delivery between 2 furious women. Luction Kugel in Pyrex. Food, food, food. Knishes in paper. Stewed chicken in jars. That I carried blushing past judgmental, all-seeing Mrs. Kravitz, peering to watch between curtains. And in the rooming house between hers and Nana's, alcoholic house painters and bums. Should the government add riboflavin supplements to their cheap, sweet wine? Because you are lukewarm, says God, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. Substance of charity and of luxury. Under the regime of the tree of life, no longer will the rulers ration the food of the people. Substance of woe mounting, hot honey of tears, substance of grieving, salt oil of sustenance down to the husk.
When we were in Granada the first time, on the first festival, we bury ignorance. So each year we bury something else. This time was obviously lack of love. Anyways, this poem, I was fascinated by Robert discovering Granada and the things. We were in the hotel El Alhambra right in front of the plaza, and there were so many things going on that particular plaza that it was fascinating, and I will be fascinated seeing Robert contemplating all of those things. And I thought in the back of my mind, sure enough, there will be a poem out of this, and here we are. It's called Food, Comida. Comida. Sustancia de carencia, sustancia primogénea del deseo. Si tú puedes cocinar como caminas, chiquita, yo comería hasta la cáscara. En Granada, Nicaragua, el logo Food, desplegado en un camión, palabra de marca registrada como Häagen-Dazs en ningún lenguaje excepto en la sombría lengua de los significados. Un niño mendigo apunta su boca, sustancia de comunión, sustancia de necesidad. Cuando yo era niño, mi familia peleaba por ella, casi tanto como por el dinero. Comida, comida, comida. Mi madre, que rehusaba cocinar, se enfrentó amargamente con su madre, mi abuela, que vivía 4 puertas más allá. Y yo, el avergonzado niño emisario de los envíos entre las dos, mujeres furiosas, fideos Luchenkugel en Pyrex, comida, 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 bizcochos Nissers en papel, pollo cocido que llevaba en jarro sonrojado, pasando enfrente de la cotilla y criticona señora Kravets, que espiaba con su mirada entre las cortinas. Y en la casa de hospedaje, entre la suya y de la nana, de pintores de brocha gorda y vagabundos. ¿Debe el gobierno añadir suplementos de riboflavina a sus baratos vinos dulces? ¿Por qué ustedes son tibios, dice Dios, ni calientes ni fríos? Los voy a escupir desde mi boca, sustancia de caridad y de lujo. Bajo el régimen del árbol de la vida, nunca más los gobernantes racionarán el alimento del pueblo. Sustancia de su drama que crece, miel caliente de lágrimas, sustancia de antojo, aceite salado del sostenimiento hasta la cáscara.
There was a truck that had on it the trade name Food.
F-U-D.
Yeah. This poem, The Refinery, was published in La Prensa. While we were there in the festival, Luis Alberto translated it that efficiently. And it will be interesting to talk about, if we have a chance, to talk about how moments in the poem are so much of this country and indeed germane to this city. And then translated into another language becomes something else in Spanish. The Refinery, our language, forged in the dark by centuries of violent pressure, underground, out of the stuff of dead life. The analogy in the poem is between petroleum and the English language, or language itself. This is dead life from which we get energy. And where the poem asks, who are the gods who wanted us to do this? Who are the gods who wanted us to take that dead life and make things out of it and get energy out of it? Who are the gods who want us to make these grunts that would then communicate and become so important? The Refinery, thirsty and languorous after their long black sleep, the old gods crooned and shuffled and shook their heads, dry, dry. By railroad, they set out across the desert of stars to drink the world our mouths had soaked in the strange sentences we made while they were asleep. A pollen-tinted slurry of passion and lapsed intention. whose imagined taste made the savage deities hiss and snort. In the lightless carriages, a smell of snake and coarse fur, glands of lymphless breath and ichor, the avid stenches of immortal bodies. Their long train clicked and slid through the gulfs of night between the planets and came down through the evening fog of redwood canyons. From the train at sunset, fiery warehouse windows along a wharf. Then dusk, a gash of neon. Bar, black pine woods, a junction crossing, glimpses of sluggish surf among the rocks, a moan of dreamy forgotten divinity, calling and fading against the windows of a town. Inside the train, a flash of dragonfly wings, an antlered brow, black night again, and then, after the bridge, a palace on the water. The refinery, the great refinery, impossible city of lights, a million bulbs tracing its turreted boulevards and mazes. The castle of a person pronounced alive. The corporation, a fictional lord, real in law. Barbicans and torches along the siding where the engine slows at the central tanks. A ward of steel palisades, valved and chandeliered. The muttering gods greedily penetrate those bright pavilions. Libation of benzene, naphthalene, asphalt, gasoline, tar, syllables fractioned and cracked from unarticulated crude, the smeared heap of life that fed on itself in pitchy darkness when the gods were new, inedible, volatile, and sublimated afresh to sting our tongues who use it, refined from oil of stone. The gods batten on the vats and drink up love cries and memorized Chaucer, lines from movies and songs hoarded in mortmain, exile's charms. The basal or desperate distillates of breath, steep, brewed, and spent, as though we were their aphids or their bees that monstered up sweetness for them while they dozed.
You notice the syllables that Robert used in this particular poem and talking about language. Spanish is such a, fluent or not fluent, but harmonious type of a language. So it's very difficult to translate that part of the poem on the one hand, and also from the cultural point of view. When he talks about the corporation as the Lord, as a person, in Latin America, we are not too pro-corporation and we don't treat them that well. So this is the difficulty in translation a poem, but in any case, I won't repeat what I said. Hopefully you heard me there. So it's difficult to translate this poem from the point of imitating those syllables that you saw Robert pronounce and so typical of the English language, when Spanish is more melodious, there is more melody on it, and also from a cultural point of view, because a corporation here is treated as a lord, obviously in a very sarcastic way.
Son personas
legales, legal persons. Well, in Latin America, we don't quite think so. But in any case, the refinery at the same time appears in this poem a little bit as a monster, which I like it. And that thing is maybe a little bit cultural as well. La refinería. Nuestro lenguaje, forjado en la oscuridad por siglos de presión violenta, soterrado de materia de vida muerta. Sedientos y lánguidos después de su largo dormir negro, los viejos dioses canturreaban y barajaban y sacudían sus cabezas. Seco, seco, en tren partieron a través del desierto de estrellas a beber el mundo, que nuestras bocas habían empapado de las frases extrañas que nosotros construimos, mientras ellos dormían, teñidas de polen un limo de pasión y una deslizada intención, cuyo imaginado sabor hizo que las divinidades salvajes silbaran y roncaran. En los carruajes sin luz, un olor de serpiente y piel tosca, glándulas de aliento sin linfas y la sangre suprema, el tufo ávido de los cuerpos inmortales. El largo tren daba chasquidos y suspiraba por los golfos de la noche entre los planetas y descendió por la niebla vespertina de los cañones de las secuoyas. Desde el tren a la caída del sol, ventanas ardientes de bodegas a lo largo del muelle, luego el crepúsculo, un tajo de neón, bar, bosque de pinos negros, un cruce, vistazos de un oleaje perezoso entre las rocas, un quejido de una divinidad olvidada, soñolienta, que llamaba y palidecía contra las ventanas de un pueblo. Dentro el tren, un flash de alas de libélula, el asta de una ceja. Noche negra de nuevos y entonces después del puente un palacio sobre el agua. La refinería, la gran refinería, ciudad imposible de luces, 1 millón de lámparas trazando sus guarnecidos bulevares y laberintos. El castillo de una persona declarada con vida, la corporación, un ficticio señor auténtico ante la ley. Barbacanas y antorchas a lo largo del costado donde la máquina se frena ante los tanques centrales, una sala de acantilados de acero embalulados e iluminados. Los dioses murmuradores avaramente penetran esos pabellones brillantes. Libación de benzina, naftalina, asfalto, gasolina, alquitrán, sílabas fraccionadas y agrietadas del crudo, inarticulado, la sucia mazmorra de vida que se alimenta de sí misma en la oscuridad alquitranada, donde los dioses eran nuevos, incomibles, volátiles y sublimados otra vez para picar nuestras lenguas que lo usan, refinados del aceite de piedra. Los dioses cierran con cerrojo los estanques y beben gemidos de amor y un chacer memorizado, frases de películas, canciones amontonadas en manos muertas, embrujos de exilios, los bazares o desesperadas destilaciones del aliento, empapado, fermentado, agotado, como si fuéramos sus pulgones o sus abejas que diseñaron un monstruo de dulzura para ellos mientras dormitaban.
I know what Luis Alberto means when he talks about a certain kind of harshness or aggressiveness in English, and I think the translation is, insofar as I'm objective, which is hardly at all, to get that sílabas fraccionadas y agrietadas del crudo inarticulado. It has that, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm impressed by it. Salute it.
I took a class from him because I will consult him, well, how do you like this word, and so on and so forth. Does it sound good in Spanish? Yeah, it sounds good. All kind of arts and things like that, very harsh.
Well, we'll do one more, and then we'll have a conversation with Georgette.
Sounds good.
Good. Antique. I drowned in the fire of having you. I burned in the river of not having you. We lived together for hours in a house of 1,000 rooms, and we were parted for 1,000 years. 10 minutes ago, we raised our children, who cover the earth and have forgotten that we existed. It was not Maya. It was not a ladder to perfection. It was this cold sunlight falling on this warm earth. When I turned, you went to hell. When your ship fled the battle, I followed you and lost the world without regret, but with stormy recriminations. Someday, far down that corridor of horror, the future, Someone who buys this picture of you for the frame at a stall in a dwindled city will study your face and decide to harbor it a little while longer from the waters of anonymity, the acids of breath.
This is a great poem, and I had difficulty with the title, Antique. In fact, and it's good because it's familiar, my middle son used to call Lillian's father, his grandfather, Antique. So, anyways, I choose the title Antigüedad, even though, again, it's something that doesn't quite reflect what an antique is, and particularly in this particular poem. But anyways, Antigüedad. Me ahogué en el fuego de tenerte, me quemé en el río de no tenerte. Vivimos juntos durante horas en una casa de 1000 habitaciones y nos separamos durante miles de años. Hace 10 minutos criamos a nuestros hijos que abarcan la tierra y se han olvidado de que nosotros existimos. No era una diosa de ilusiones, no era una escalera hacia la perfección. Era esta fría luz solar cayendo sobre la tierra tibia. Cuando me di vuelta te fuiste al infierno. Cuando tu nave huyó de la batalla, yo te seguí y perdí el mundo, sin lamentarme, pero con recriminaciones tormentosas. Algún día, bien al fondo de aquel pasillo de horror, el futuro, alguien que compre este retrato de ti por el marco, en un puesto de una ciudad disminuida, estudiará tu rostro y decidirá protegerlo un poco de tiempo más de las aguas del anonimato, los ácidos del aliento.
Now we'll have a little bit of conversation.
Right.
That was wonderful. I guess both of you know that Granada is the city of poets.
Yeah, sure.
In 1 square kilometer, there are more poets than anywhere else in the world.
Right.
Did you know it when you were there?
I met hundreds of them.
So that must have been very special.
Yes, indeed. We went to, not in Granada, but we went to Rubén Darío's house.
Yes.
And,
Yeah. It's Tierra de Poetas. Rubén Darío.
see?
Have you read Rubén Darío?
Yes.
And your Spanish is quite good, actually, Robert.
Well, Granada was actually more than the contrary to Rubén Darío. In fact, that was the land of the vanguardistas. In fact, as part of the festival, we go and start reciting poems on the church, where they used to get together on the top of the church, usually talking against Rubén Darío and then later on admiring him. But that's the case.
Can I say something?
Right. She's from Nicaragua.
And translations.
Voice of a Nicaraguan.
Right.
Yeah, because there is also an animosity between Granada and León.
Right.
At León and Granada, there's a certain
So
animosity.
Rubén Darío is from León and
Darío de León. is-
A translation is very difficult.
Right.
You know, the Italians say traduttore traidore.
Famous quotation.
Right.
So anybody
Traduttore
who is badly translated is dead in the other language. So you're very fortunate that you're very much alive. This is a very
Yes,
wonderful
this is not a
translation.
traditore, definitely not.
So you yourself translated Dante, right?
I always say the translation is a misnomer. It means carry across, translatere. I Englished the Inferno of Dante. It's a better term. It's the old, they might have said in the 16th century in Englishing. I did English the Inferno of Dante, yes.
And Luis Alberto translated poets before in English, I know that.
Yes, I did, and my theory of translation is that it's more of a copulation. It's better to copulate with somebody that is alive than rather with a dead person. Now, the son or the daughter, obviously I don't know whom will she look after or she look like, or maybe we look to some environmental situation. But it is a process where all of a sudden you have something there which is neither the original version nor a total poem in the language, but I have a translator of my own poetry, and there is one particular poem that I always tell her, your English version is better than my original Spanish version.
That's what Garcia Marquez said about Rabasa, that 100 Years of Solitude was better in English. No, and I think you followed that because you discussed the translation. That's why it's so good. I mean, you kept talking about it.
We did communicate. We did communicate with one another. I was trying to make a rough number of the number of times I was helpful to you to embrace. maybe a dozen.
Right. Yeah.
Little things I would say that, you know, that I knew just enough Spanish and just enough English to make certain suggestions that I think did help with things. I was trying to remember what the words were in Antigüedad that someone who buys este retrato de ti.
Right.
I think at one point you had photo.
Right.
And retrato, portrait is better. It should not be, you don't know what period this happens in. You know, it's Orpheus and Eurydice, it's Antony and Cleopatra, it's Adam and Eve in a way. And photo puts it too much in from the late 19th century on. And there was another word you said, what was the other word? Anyway, that was the kind of conversation that we could that were and they were the two main collaborators with these poets. And once in a while I did have something to say.
So you met there and you kept conversing afterwards.
No, we met before.
We met in Washington.
We met in Washington here.
We met in Washington, but I think we really got to know one another.
Right, more in Granada.
In that intensity at that time in Granada.
Right. But what it was interesting as well is not only the words, but for instance, between the two translators here, this is an edition that I prepared, but Andrés Catalán, who is a professor in Salamanca University, and we have two different approaches to the translation. His is more creative, more, I would say, if you were to write the poem in Spanish, you would write it more his way. And in my case, I was more literal, because I you know, in some of the poems, I think that, like Robert was playing with a ser and a star. And if, you know, if I were writing that poem in Spanish, I would not use the verb to be that much. But I think it was important on the context of what he was saying. For instance, in the poem El burro es un animal, which we won't read here, but is in the book. And by the way, too, there is an introduction to the book in which I explain all of this, my approach to translation and so on. But for instance, in that poem, Antique, it was good to talk to him a little bit of what was the poem in itself, because there are so many references, so many, you know, talking about a person and so on and so forth. And I remember talking and you telling me, no, this is about poetry. So that poetry is the subject of this poem. And that changed my approach to the translation as well. So this
Este retrato,
yeah.
este retrato de ti is my poem.
Right.
And you say, well, maybe someday somebody will buy it for the frame, you know. Someday in Nigeria, 150 years from now, someone will be studying American English of the late 20th century and say, well, here's an example I can use for this. And that's what I was thinking about for the frame.
Right.
And then the person you love has a little tiny, tiny, tiny bit of immortality because of the work of art. So running through it is all the love poetry in English. 16th century Shakespeare is contemporary. They freeze, they drown. And that hyperbolic language at the beginning when it says, you know, I drowned in the fire and I burned in the river. I hope I'm talking about actual feelings, but I'm also thinking about that whole history of poetry. So we could have a conversation like that.
What's interesting in the translation is that he really followed the rhythm. And I know you're a musician and you're a jazz lover. So you could almost sing it, you know. And actually the Spanish came through, and I think jazz is not native to the Spanish language. And you could almost like hear the rhythm through it, so I think he was very skillful, don't you
I think again of the two translators, Luis Alberto he really put a lot of energy into trying to create what were basically English rhythms, and in some ways he has jazz rhythms.
Yes.
I mean, this poem is a poem
Yes,
that I do. It's on my CD, poem jazz, and it's one I always do with musicians. It does a kind of a bluesy feeling, because as well as like a sonnet, you know, I burned, I drowned. It's also, you know, I burned in the fire of having you, and then you can almost hear that 8-bar, you know. So it's a blending of those, and he's very alert to all that, very interested in doing that.
And I was wondering how this would be received in Latin America. I know that, you know, Latin Americans are very interested in American poetry. Do you have any idea, Luis Alberto?
Yeah, I have seen a number of reviews in the internet
Oh, they've been out already?
on the book, right?
In Spanish?
In Spanish,
Okay.
and either from Spain or from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very well received. You know, this, I don't know whether you read this. They didn't like the title.
They didn't.
No, so 2 of those reviewers said, well, that title, I don't know what will be their title anyways.
Well, it's
but I
Brazil and
loved
Japan.
it.
Here's this book in Spanish, and it's Brazil and Japan.
Right, maybe that's the reason, I don't
was
know.
going to say Ginza is Japanese, right?
Right. I was not able to communicate with these reviewers because I just found them recently. This book hasn't been out that long. And so it has been well received. And all of them point out to the fact that, and I obviously talk about this in my introduction, the fact that such a great poet as Robert Pinsky was not in Spanish, was not translated in Spanish in a book form, and they really celebrate that.
This is the first time, right?
Right.
Very good. He could also read well in Japanese, I think. You know, the Japanese have an easier time learning Spanish and Portuguese than English. I know a number of Japanese who have actually moved to Brazil because they find it more acogedor.
Right. Oh, I see.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing a Japanese version of Fideo's Luxemkugeln Pirates.
That's Yiddish.
Luxemkugeln in Pirate. So you get 3 languages. You get Luxemkugeln in Yiddish, and Ein, and Fideos in Spanish, and then you get the language of Pyrex, which is this sort of pseudo-Greek trademark
But
language.
English is an incredible language because you make up words as you go along. And you know, how Borges said it's about 5 times richer or larger than any Romance language.
I'll give you one of my favorite stories about translation. The little girl next door to us, when my children were little, Ingeborg spent some of the time with her mother and father. They were German and American, respectively, in America, some in Germany. She's about 3, maybe 4 years old, and she was over our house in the wintertime, and it was time to go very nearby her house, and we were helping her get her snowsuit and her boots, and she says, "I can't find my hand shoes." She didn't say Handschuhen. She took a very inspired guess at what the English word might be for mittens, in many ways more interesting than saying mittens, and it was an act of translation.
Shoes for the hand.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, wonderful.
that's what you say in German, it's Handschuhen.
That brings me to the word Kugel, which it's not budin, it's really cake. But cake is torta.
It's not cake at all.
No, it's pudding. No, it's not cake.
It's a noodle.
It's noodles that have been baked. You take the noodles and then you bake them.
But
It's
So
a casserole. It's a noodle
But to me,
casserole.
budin is something soft.
It's
and
not
runny.
pudding. It's a noodle casserole
Right.
that you
Yeah.
eat with dinner.
it's more like a Yorkshire pudding in consistency.
Depends on the kugel.
Depends on the kugel. My grandmother's kugel was very firm. And
But Kugel could also, in regular German, could be just a cake. Like
this is what translators do. You're seeing
I
translation in
wasn't going to bring
process
that up.
here.
I was
All
gonna bring-
because of Hanshun.
I'm sorry.
Well,
We
what
only-
we did on the translation on that particular case, we left the words in Yiddish.
I think that was good.
And we put
And
a little note
in the dishes
saying,
especially. Yes.
right,
I-
right.
I think we want questions.
Let me just pass the mic around so we can make sure with your question you get recorded online. So, any questions out there? Hold on.
I always have questions about translation, as Luis Alberto knows. So, I mean, I guess for me, reading Robert Pinsky's poems, you know, it's not just the rhythm that's so present, which I would think would be difficult to translate, but also your use of words, vocabulary in English. Often, as a native English speaker, I'm running into many words that I don't know, or you're using a word in a way that it's not normally used. And so I would be curious about how Luis Alberto handled that, you know, part of that translation that, you know, did you have to, how was the process of finding out those words? What did they mean? Did you have to check with Robert, or were you able to figure it out? And then how did you kind of invent those strange words, you know, or unusual words into Spanish?
In some cases, I just invented a word. For instance, in the Refinery, I used the word embalbuladas, which obviously, basically, my criterion was it would be a word that it will be understood in some way. Válvula is okay, but embalbuladas doesn't exist. But it was the only way to do it because I couldn't find anything else. In some other cases, I found words that I could use that obviously were, you know, tried to respect the meaning, the original meaning. But it wasn't easy, as you know it. I mean, when you translated my own poetry, we communicated quite often, and the fact that the poet is bilingual, like is the case of Robert, it helps a lot because I will say, well, listen, what about this word? And he will say, no, this is more too high class. I like something really much lower. Remember that conversation? More simple. Okay, let me come with something else.
We recommend to you the poem named for the first lesson in the Spanish book. There is a poem called El burro es un animal. It involves many obscenities, and my learned colleague had to do a lot of research, but how would this terrible word, what would it be in Argentina, what would it be in Mexico, and it turns out one of the ways that the language varies in different countries is that the cursing and the obscenity is very indigenous to each place. He had to choose.
Well, and after doing the research, I went with demographic statistics, and I obviously figured out that 31 million out of the 50 million Spanish-speaking people in the U.S. come from Mexican descent, and obviously Mexico is the largest Hispanic-speaking country in the world. So I used the Mexican language. And
Mexican obscenities won.
Yeah. And I think it had a certain success because when we read this poem in a poetry festival in Los Angeles, where most of the audience was from Mexico, they really reacted very strongly to the translation. But you know, that happens not only that in those particular cases that the language or the meaning of the words differs from one country to another. For instance, you will use a word in Spain which will mean nothing, will be a regular word that you use every day. Let's say, for instance, the word coger. Coger means to take something. Estoy cogiendo el vaso. I am taking the... Well, in Argentina, that word is totally a bad word. Do not use it, please, if you go to Argentina. Now, but not only that happens between one country and another, but also inside a country. There is a difference, like in the north and in the south, in Latin America, in the north of Argentina to the middle or so on, or in Mexico. So that's the reason why it's so difficult to translate that type of a language. It's so intimate, so territorial, and well, I could tell 100 stories on that, but
I'm one want to just take the opportunity to ask a question. I was struck as you were reading the Spanish translations, how much more rhyme there was, and how did you feel about that, the way in which the Spanish language worked in terms of developing a kind of rhyme, a rhythm through rhyme that wasn't necessarily there. I mean, there was a lot of repetition in those poems, but the rhyming was it seemed more subtle and more kind of elaborate.
Well, really the intent in my translation was because I knew and I can obviously feel it in reading in English the rhythm, and obviously as a great French poet said, obviously poetry is basically music. If there is no music in the line, in the verse, obviously, then poetry is in a sense lost. It's more important that rhyme, actual rhyme. Obviously, you know, one of my frustration was that it was difficult to translate because the beauty of Robert Pinsky poems and lines are precisely the richness of the syllables. Those are not common, and that was a little bit of a frustration. But on the other hand, as far as conserving the music and the rhythm, in Spanish is easy because of the preponderance, for instance, of words that the accents goes on the second syllable, like you know, so osado and so on and so forth. So it's more musical, and that's more melodic. But I know that it's very difficult to if he was reciting this poem in a jazz form, there will be rhythm in Spanish, but it will not quite translate the richness of his syllables. And
there's a technical aspect to this. Spanish, you might say, is a pure language. Spanish has 5 vowels: a, e, I, o, u. That's it. A, e, I, o, u. English for a alone has e, I was sort of American English. So in English, instead of 5 vowels, I've never counted them, probably have 14. And even before immigration in this country, the island was repeatedly invaded. And you know, the French-speaking invasion of the 11th century was only one episode, you know, Vikings coming in and displacing various kinds of Saxons, and the Saxons killing and raping and marrying the Celts. And the English dictionary is much bigger than the French or the Italian or the Spanish, because English is a very gobbling language. It takes all these things in, and it has many sounds, more sounds, so that sometimes an English speaker, Italian or Spanish, was, oh, it sounds so beautiful, it sounds so beautiful. I always say it must be terrible to be a poet in Italian or Spanish when everything sounds beautiful. You say, you know, the bureaucrat vomited on his computer, and it sounds great.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Well, thank you, Luis Alberto, for such a fantastic work. We all know that translating is a labor of love, because it's not your own work. You're, you know, doing it. You're giving the poet another language for him to communicate. The other thing that I want to say is, being from Nicaragua, maybe you meant Granada, Spain. I would think that Granada, Spain is a city of poets. In the case of my country, the city of poets is León. That's where Rubén Darío was born, and that's where these 3 famous that we call Los Grandes, the greatest. We have the 3 greatest poets also: Salomón de la Selva, father, the priest, a Catholic priest, Azarías H. Palais, and Alfonso Cortés, who was such a wonderful poet that all of his work, mostly his work, was done when he was, they said, in a nut house. You know, he was crazy. But he's a fantastic poet, so that's another comment.
What a great program for Georgette and Rob to have a program León contra Granada.
Granada, right.
And have a debate.
All right. Yeah, because I can mention about 20 poets from Granada, from the avant-garde, against Darío, such as Pablo Antonio Cuadra.
But you know, Darío is so great in the Spanish language that even the Spanish people claim it as his own.
Oh, yeah, sure.
They say, Rubén Darío, oh, I grew up learning poems, thinking that he was from Spain. The Argentines said the same. I was once sitting in the audience in Maputo, Mozambique, and this Argentine PhD said, yes, Rubén Darío from Argentina. And I wanted to get up and, and I actually passed a small paper.
Well, Borges said that there are 2 times in Spanish literature, is before and after Darío.
Yes,
Those are
because he
2
modernized the Spanish language. The
Right.
third comment that I wanted to make, and I'm going to be very quick, is that our lives in translation, because Western civilization, it's a work in translation. The Bible that we read every day in English and Spanish and French, we didn't take it from English, Spanish, and French. We took it from Hebrew, and then from Hebrew came the Latin Vulgata, right? The vulgar Latin for everybody to understand. So our lives, really, Western civilization, our lives in translation. So it's great to be translated. Congratulations.
I was going to say, I was told that Granada is busy.
Well, on that note, I think we will end this evening's event. Thanks so much for coming out. Thanks to Luis Alberto Ambroggio and to Robert Pinsky, our full court laureate.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.